Tonight at 6, plans are being drawn up to make Christmas as normal as possible, say government scientists. Looking for some festive cheer, but there are warnings that a few days of family gatherings may mean many more days of tighter restrictions on either side of Christmas.
Coming into Christmas, we need to be very careful about the number of contacts that we have to reduce transmission before Christmas and get our cases as low as possible.
We'll be asking how tight restrictions may need to be to allow festive gatherings to go ahead. Also tonight, Pfizer says its new COVID vaccine is almost 95% effective for people over the age of 65. Digging down deep to transform the way we heat our homes, the plans to replace 600,000 gas boilers a year with electric heat pumps. Jeremy Corbyn won't be reinstated as a Labour MP despite being readmitted to the party, says its leader, Sir Keir Starmer. And turning other people's lives around, the charity that's helping to tackle the big rise in loneliness during the pandemic.
And coming up on BBC News, England World Cup winner Sir Geoff Hurst has called for more research into dementia and football after 4 members of the 1966 team died with the condition.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. How many more days of tight coronavirus restrictions will we need before Christmas if families want to get together over the festive season? That's the question government scientists and ministers are looking at. One of the government's medical advisors on COVID, Dr. Susan Hopkins, says they are working on a plan to make Christmas as close to normal as possible for just a few days. But she warned that a few days of greater freedom may well mean many more days of tighter restrictions. All 4 UK nations are trying to work out a common approach to the holiday, but it's dependent on how much cases fall over the next few weeks. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
Will it be a Christmas nightmare or a dream come true? A question being widely asked as people look beyond the current lockdown in England, due to end in early December. Those we spoke to in Manchester were hoping the rules would allow some form of celebration.
It would be nice if everyone could get together and everywhere was to get to back to some sort of normality.
I mean, it would be amazing, and I think like many families we've had a bereavement as well, so it would mean a huge amount to be able to spend the time together.
Senior officials stressed that ministers would decide, but they were open to the idea of a Christmas relaxation.
We are very keen that we have Christmas as close to normal as possible. That requires all of us to make every effort over this national restriction period and even in early December.
So is some sort of Christmas possible, do you think?
So I think it is. Coming into Christmas, we need to be very careful about the number of contacts that we have to reduce transmission. Once we have got past the Christmas period, if there's been a release and some socialisation, we will all have to be very responsible and reduce those contacts again.
Scotland's First Minister set out her position on the Christmas issue.
We are all desperate for some normality at Christmas, and I absolutely include myself in that. And the Scottish Government right now is working very closely and well with the other UK nations to try to agree a way for that to happen.
Decisions in England have to be made on how the tier system might work in December. Officials think the highest tier restrictions in place in the northwest before the full lockdown had an effect on curbing the virus. Daily hospital admissions of COVID patients in the region, which had gone up sharply, have begun to level off and fall a little. Allowing a limited mixing of households is one thing, but deciding what will be permitted for pubs, bars and restaurants is another matter. It's normally their busiest time of the year in the run-up to Christmas, but health officials are concerned that a full reopening will see a further spread of the virus. This bar in Manchester only opened in March, just before the first lockdown. They had to close, reopen and then close again, and they're desperate to get customers back in.
We really need a strong December to make as much money as we in normal circumstances as possible in order to get through the first 2-3 months of 2021.
Trade-offs and difficult decisions will be needed on what exactly will open up over Christmas and for how long, and what will have to stay closed. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
There's yet more reason to be optimistic about the coronavirus vaccine being developed by Pfizer and BioNTech. Final trials show that it is almost 95% effective in people over the age of 65. What's more, it has passed safety checks, making it ready for approval by authorities around the world. It's due to arrive in the UK by the end of the year. Our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, has more.
Yet more good news on vaccines. Last week, Pfizer-BioNTech were the first to show their vaccine protected against COVID. Now we have more detail. Pfizer says the vaccine is more than 94% effective among the over 65s and showed the same consistent protection among volunteers from different ethnicities. There were 170 cases of COVID-19 across more than 40,000 volunteers. 162 of those were among the volunteers who got dummy or placebo jabs, and only 8 in the vaccinated group. There were no serious safety concerns, but a small minority of volunteers suffered significant headaches or fatigue.
I think this is good news, and also very encouraging that the vaccine seems to show equal protection in elderly people, because that was a question we couldn't answer after the first announcements last week.
Our immune system usually declines as we age, so it's highly significant that the vaccine protects the elderly who are most at risk from COVID. They should be first in line to get the jab, which requires 2 doses a month apart. Booster doses may be needed as we don't know how long protection lasts. Vaccinators will go into care homes to immunise vulnerable older residents. GP surgeries will play a crucial role. Some could be open 7 days a week. And large venues like sports halls will be used for mass immunisation. The Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at -70 degrees, which creates some logistical problems, but it remains usable for a few days in a normal fridge. It's thought regulators could approve the vaccine by early December. The UK has bought 40 million doses, but most of these will arrive next year. Nonetheless, it seems increasingly likely that some COVID immunisation will begin before Christmas. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Well, the latest government figures show there were 19,609 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. It means that the average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is now 24,802. 1,745 people have been admitted to hospital on average each day over the week to last Saturday. And 529 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means, on average, in the past week, 416 deaths were announced every day. And it takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 53,274. Well, Hugh Pym is with me now, so let's talk about Christmas. It looks like there may be a pretty normal Christmas, but it's all kind of restrictions on either side of that to achieve it.
Well, that's right, Sophie. What will be absolutely crucial is reducing transmission of the virus, getting that vital R number below 1 to show the virus is receding. And the challenge for the government at Westminster, for England, is what sort of regime to have after December the 2nd, once the current lockdown ends, how you bring back a tiered system with maybe tougher restrictions in some areas. And what we learned today is this calculation used by experts on the SAGE committee that for every 1 day of relaxation, you need 5 days of tougher restrictions. Now, whether that would apply either side of Christmas or all after Christmas, if you allowed a relaxation over the festive season, is really not completely clear at this stage. But what's become very, very clear today is that scientific advisors are working very hard to come up with some sort of package of measures to allow at least some mixing of families over the Christmas season.
Hugh, thank you, and apologies for the rather strange camera move in the middle of that. The government has unveiled its plan for what it says is a green industrial revolution to hit its target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. From 2030, the sale of new wholly diesel and petrol cars will be banned, a decade earlier than originally planned, but some hybrid vehicles will be allowed. There will be more money for new nuclear power, including 16 mini nuclear plants. And a target to replace 600,000 gas boilers a year by 2028 by installing low-energy heat pumps. To carry out these plans, the government has committed £4 billion in new spending as part of a broader £12 billion package. And it says it hopes 250,000 new green jobs will be created. With more details, here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
Eliminating carbon emissions is a mammoth project which will need a lot of tools. Wind power, a new generation of nuclear energy to replace the old, and electrifying transport. All of them were included in the government's 10-point plan for what it's calling a green industrial revolution. But it's projects like this one in Oxford which may prove the unlikely front line in the battle against climate change.
When you think of a huge issue like climate change, you might think of international summits, Extinction Rebellion protests, offshore wind turbines. But the truth is that if we're going to get to net zero, the way we heat our homes is one of the toughest nuts to crack. This is an industrial revolution that will be coming right to our front doors.
These pipes extract heat from under the ground, which is pumped into the home for heating and hot water. It's a replacement technology for the 25 million gas boilers which will have to be ripped out.
Gas boilers are going. We cannot continue to do what we've done for years and years and years. And I believe the future is heat pumps. The technology exists today.
Local resident Paul Brennan told me why he agreed to be part of this housing association pilot scheme.
The initial attraction was the bills will be cheaper, the electricity bill will be cheaper, and that in itself will have a knock-on effect in terms of being better for the environment, using up less resources, for instance.
Each house cost nearly £15,000 to convert. That's why this is going to be so difficult. Easier by comparison, a technology that has come of age and down in price.
It's brought the environmental issues into people's minds.
Nevertheless, bringing forward a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by a whole decade from 2040 to 2030 will get car owners' attention.
It is ambitious, but I think it's achievable. The charging infrastructure has got to grow, but that's a bit of a chicken and egg situation because the cars aren't on the road yet. And we need the manufacturers to roll out new models.
Technology to extract and store carbon from heavy industry will see investment, along with experiments in hydrogen and small nuclear reactors. So, does it constitute a revolution?
It's an exciting day in terms of getting us back on the front foot. Is it enough? No, of course it's not enough, and we'll be looking next week to the Chancellor in terms of what's coming out of the spending review.
The Committee on Climate Change estimates it will require £30 billion in investment every year for the next 30 years. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said where the government led, private investment would follow.
We think the amount of money that we're investing in this will be dwarfed by the amount of money that comes in from, of course, those new technologies and people wanting to invest in the sector. The important thing is government is leading the way.
Perhaps not a revolution, but a down payment on a green future the government hopes will create new jobs, even new industries along the way. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The government spending watchdog says normal standards of transparency were set aside by government ministers at the start of the pandemic as they scrambled to get supplies of personal protective equipment. The National Audit Office says firms recommended by MPs and peers were given priority in contracts. But the Prime Minister said he was proud of what was achieved when it came to sourcing PPE. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has more.
The £21 million man. Spanish businessman Gabriel Anderson got that amount in consulting fees on a UK PPE deal. The BBC revealed yesterday he got paid for helping the founder of a Miami jewellery company who'd won the contracts. So it was ultimately British taxpayers' money. From pendants to PMQs.
Does the Prime Minister think that £21 million to a middleman was an acceptable use of taxpayers' money?
The Prime Minister answered from self-isolation.
We were facing, as he will remember, a very difficult situation where across the world there were not adequate supplies of PPE. Nobody had enough PPE. We shifted heaven and earth to get 32 billion items of PPE into this country. I'm very proud of what has been achieved.
The public spending watchdog, the NAO, says it will investigate these payments. And today it criticised the government for the way it had bought PPE, saying it hadn't been open enough about the way decisions were made. So how did companies get to supply hospitals with the PPE they so desperately needed? Well, it turns out there was a VIP fast-track route. And if companies were recommended by ministers, MPs, peers or officials, they were 10 times more likely to get a government contract. BBC News revealed in August, Pestfix, a small pest control company, had problems with the masks they'd supplied. The report reveals they were put on the VIP fast track by mistake. The spending watchdog also flagged potential conflicts of interest. Public First was paid more than £500,000 for focus groups. Its founders previously worked for and advised Michael Gove. The company says it worked on a pay-as-you-go deal. As the BBC also revealed, Ianda Capital got a £250 million contract. Andrew Mills, the man helping Ianda, was also a government trade advisor. And we reported Ianda's 50 million masks the government bought for £150 million couldn't be used in the NHS.
Did you use political connections to get the contract?
No, absolutely not.
How come then the man working for your company leading the bid was a government trade advisor?
It's a coincidence. He certainly used those connections to approach the Cabinet Office in the sense of he managed to find out who he needed to call. That's the extent of the use of those connections.
Experienced companies like Arco say they weren't aware of any VIP fast-track route.
We did not get a reply from our inquiries or our offers for help. So it was a real surprise when we saw these contracts being awarded to companies that just do not have the investment in the supply chain, the expertise.
PPE was needed fast, but did speed overtake buying the right equipment at a fair price? Lucy Manning, BBC News.
The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, says Jeremy Corbyn will not be allowed to sit as a Labour MP. He was reinstated as a member of the party yesterday. He had been suspended after saying that the scale of anti-Semitism in the party had been overstated following a scathing report into the issue. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, is at Westminster, and this decision has caused some division in the party.
Well, Sophie, it's certainly a very tricky political situation here for the Labour leader. That report that you mentioned really was terrible. It was a report from the Independent Equalities Commission, which said that the party that had been founded to fight for equality had breached equalities law when it came to racism towards Jewish people during the time that Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. Our viewers don't need any reminding how much angst there was over this issue while Jeremy Corbyn was the boss of the Labour Party, and he provoked more outrage on the day it was published by seeking to try to play it down. Now, since then, yesterday, he did try to clarify what he meant, and as a result, that saw him being let back into the party. But that is not the same as being allowed again to sit called a Labour MP. Now, that decision was taken by Keir Starmer, and he said he wasn't going to let that happen because he was worried that Jeremy Corbyn had been trying to undermine the party's attempts to move on from this whole sorry mess. But Jeremy Corbyn has still got a band of very noisy supporters in the Labour Party. Some union leaders, a couple of dozen MPs who speak out on this, and many members who think this is outrageous. They think this is a mistake. They question why was he let back into the party, but isn't then allowed to sit on the green benches again and has to now sit as an independent. But I think that given Keir Starmer's main message to the public has always been that he will clear up anti-Semitism before he does anything else, I'm not sure that he had very much political choice here. Perhaps the theory was it's better to tear off the plaster rather than let the wound fester. And it is another step on his journey, Sophie, to try to show the public that Labour is changing since that defeat in the election in December that was so terrible for them.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you. The time is coming up to 6:20, our top story this evening. Government scientists say plans are being drawn up to make Christmas as close to normal as possible, but they warn COVID restrictions may be needed on either side of the festive period. And turning people's lives around, the charity that's helping to tackle the surge in loneliness during this pandemic.
Coming up on Sports Day on BBC News, doubts over the staging of the Australian Open after the state of Victoria suggested it was unlikely players would be allowed into the country until the end of December.
Just how much inappropriate and harmful content are children being exposed to online? Police are warning parents that more and more young people, especially teenage boys, are being contacted by far-right extremists on social media, and they've seen a big rise during lockdown. Callum Tully reports.
Just an ordinary lad. We used to have laughs, we quite close as a family, and he was always, you know, just my lad, my boy. He was convicted of membership of prescribed terrorist organisation, National Action, and he's now in prison serving 4.5 years.
Kath's son discovered far-right material on his computer as a teenager.
The more time he spent online, the worse things were getting. He was coming out with things like that the Holocaust didn't happen and that Hitler was right.
How many of you have experienced or seen far-right racist material online? All of you?
These students say online extremism is easy to find.
How young were you when you first came across far-right material online?
So I don't know, probably around like 11, 12, but I guess...
11?
Yeah, I mean, you'll spend a lot of time, at a young age, like at least like in this generation, you spend a lot of time online.
I could imagine myself going down a different path. If I stayed ignorant and I didn't make an effort to educate myself and actually think about what I'm saying, then I'd be a very different person to who I am today.
In a matter of seconds, all of us here can join a chat and take part in far-right extremism and join their ideologies in a matter of seconds, just with a click.
We wanted to find out for ourselves how easy it is to come across right-wing material online. We set up an Instagram account posing as a 16-year-old boy. In less than a week, a right-wing group had invited us to a chat room on a messaging platform synonymous with the far right.
I've been added to extremely racist chat groups which call for the repatriation of immigrants and use the most offensive racial slurs. I've been recruited into an online group calling itself United Britain, with members, some of whom say non-whites have no right to be in this country, or that liberal thinking must be purged from our people. And now I'm being asked to recruit others into this group. So this is where it ends for me, but this is just 1 month after setting up our Instagram account.
Facebook, which owns Instagram, say they've banned over 250 white supremacist organisations and removed content that supports these groups. From January 2019 to June this year, 17 boys under the age of 18 were arrested for terrorism. More than half were for right-wing extremism. The police are so worried they've created a website for concerned parents called Act Early.
They're not just groomers, they're cowards. These are not people who are going to act themselves. They want to use your child or somebody else who's very vulnerable to do their acts for them, and we need to stop that.
I miss my son. We're just a normal family. This can happen to anybody.
Callum Tully, BBC News.
West Midlands Police have made an arrest in connection with the Birmingham pub bombings in 1974, in which 21 people were killed. Counter-terrorism officers working with the Police Service of Northern Ireland detained a 65-year-old man at his home in Belfast, which is now being searched. The BBC has announced that a former president of the Court of Appeal, Lord Dyson, will head an independent investigation into how Panorama secured an interview with Princess Diana in 1995. The inquiry will look at how Martin Bashir obtained the interview with Princess Diana, how much the BBC knew of his methods, and how effective the BBC's subsequent investigation into them was. The lorry driver from Northern Ireland who dropped off a trailer carrying 39 Vietnamese migrants who then died crossing the English Channel has told the Old Bailey that he is devastated for the migrants' families. Eamon Harrison said he did not know they were inside. He told the court he towed the airtight trailer to the port in Belgium, but by the time it was opened in the UK, all the people inside were dead. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports.
An airtight lorry trailer containing 39 Vietnamese migrants being dropped off at Zeebrugge port last October. At the wheel, Eamon Harrison, a young lorry driver from Northern Ireland. By the time the ferry carrying the trailer sailed up the River Thames just east of London, all 39 migrants had suffocated to death. Mo Robinson, another lorry driver from Northern Ireland, collected the trailer. When he opened the door, there was a puff of vapour and he saw 39 bodies lying on the floor. Today, the first driver, Eamon Harrison, used an expletive to explain to the jury how bad he felt about what happened. He said that he was devastated for the families of those who died. Eamon Harrison's barrister asked him if he knew that there were people in the trailer, and he replied simply, no. He told the jury that he'd got into debt with his boss after crashing his lorry while drunk in Germany, and that he'd agreed only to do jobs involving stolen goods. The jury has seen CCTV showing that Eamon Harrison had dropped off 3 trailers in Zeebrugge on 3 different occasions last October, including on the fatal night, and has heard that all of them had contained migrants. But he insisted that each time he was unaware there were people on board. Daniel Sandford, BBC News, at the Old Bailey.
Millions of Britons, young and old, are coping with record levels of loneliness and isolation during lockdown as we head into the winter. Figures from the Office for National Statistics suggest before the pandemic, more than 2.5 million adults were always or often lonely. By the start of this month, that number jumped to more than 4 million. Elaine Dunkley has this report.
Loneliness and isolation feels like being in a grave. It's cold, it's dark, and it's pointless.
Just trying to find the next of kin of this gentleman that we're really concerned about at the moment. Loneliness and isolation drives everything.
At Huddersfield train station is Platform 1. It's a charity on the front line of isolation, loneliness and crisis.
I've never struggled before in my life, but this time you can go and unload a bit of your baggage with a friend or whoever, and or you can go out and socialise with somebody and let that steam off. You can't at the moment. You sat at home looking at the 4 walls. You end up getting in that dark place.
1408 service. This 1950s carriage is used as a workshop, a place for men to talk and get mental health support. Lockdown and regulations has stopped many coming here.
Before pandemic, we were seeing up to 50 guys a day. They came in here and they wanted community and they wanted connection. When COVID came, that stopped the connection. And so far this year, we've had 15 guys on suicide watch. Last year, we had 1.
Platform 1 works with more than 500 men across Yorkshire. But such is the demand, it's now opened its doors to women.
Traumatic experiences are going to creep up.
Sophie suffered childhood trauma. The pandemic has brought issues to the surface.
Every day it's a challenge to believe that I am someone who is loved, and mentally that makes me very suicidal. During this isolation, working from home has had more of an effect on me to want to self-harm.
How has Platform 1 helped you?
My crisis support here at Platform 1 is actually a form of normality for me at the moment, being able to speak to someone other than someone over a Zoom call.
Lives have been saved here. Shane lost his mother and his job and was struggling in isolation until he found the charity.
Now as some of my neighbours call me, Mr. Community, because I fix kids' bikes up for them and I've got a purpose in life.
Shane has come a long way from the days when he was so lonely he talked to the furniture in his house. Now he's a volunteer.
I come in and I think, great, I've helped somebody. I might have just turned them around, because I've been there, I know what it was like. They're not sat there talking to chairs like I did.
Platform 1 offers hope, but there is also fear. With Christmas around the corner, loneliness will be felt more acutely because of the pandemic. Elaine Dunkley, BBC News in Huddersfield.
And for details of organisations offering information and support with emotional distress, do go to bbc.co.uk/action line, or you can call for free at any time to hear recorded information on 0800 066 066. And finally, news of a baby alien that has found its way into the International Space Station. This one came from Earth. The astronauts who've just arrived in a private space capsule decided to take it with them, and he has become an online hit. It's the Star Wars character Baby Yoda, seen here by the astronauts' feet. They traditionally carry a stuffed toy to show them when they've left the pull of Earth's gravity, And this crew chose Baby Yoda as their zero-gravity indicator. He has now been released into the space station to the delight of Star Wars fans. Let's have a look at the weather now with Helen Willits.
Sophie, we're going to have a short, sharp blast of Arctic air across the UK tonight and tomorrow. And that's all associated with low pressure and strong winds. That's the other feature of the weather. So we say goodbye to the Atlantic influence for a short time. Here's that Arctic air, but already by the end of tomorrow, we'll be back towards the Atlantic pool. So we've got some rain still to clear in eastern areas, lots of heavy showers following on behind. This main area of rain takes centre stage in the north overnight, turning to snow over the Scottish hills and mountains. Such is the chill in that air coming down from the north. And of course, that will pose the risk of not just some snow around lying over the hillier routes, but also some ice as well. Further south, clearer skies developing, but still plenty of showers packing in, and the winds are really going to escalate through the night. Initially, northern western areas seeing those gales as we drift towards tomorrow morning. Gales down the North Sea coast, lots of showers, still wintry in the north. They will, though, as the day goes on, as will the winds tend to ease. So the drier spells, the sunny spells become lengthier, the winds become generally lighter into the afternoon. But it's still going to feel cold. We had about 16 in the south today, more like 10, and only 3 or 4 in northern Scotland. You add on the strength of the wind, particularly through the first part of the day, and that will really feel much colder indeed, like a winter's day. Now, as we head into tomorrow night and the weekend, we're back to the Atlantic influence. We're bringing in the weather fronts. We're bringing in the cloudy skies, the rain once again. By the weekend, our weather front's dragging its heels south. Was not that much rain by the looks of things, but still a lot of cloud. And at the moment, Friday looks quite soggy. Initially, a little bit of sleetiness over the hills of Scotland. Slightly higher temperatures, but I still think it'll feel chilly out and about without the sunshine and with a bit more breeze once again. As I say, for the weekend, still a lot of dry weather around, but under the influence of the Atlantic, there will be quite a bit of cloud as well coming in on that southwesterly wind. Sophie.
Helen, thank you. And that's all from us. So it's goodbye from me on BBC One. We join the BBC's news teams where you are. Goodbye.